Daniel, thank you. You want a glass of water? Sure. Let me, Daniel, first of all, let me thank you for what I thought was a very insightful sort of tour de force of where are we now. But yet at the same time, I think you've left us all more than a little frustrated. I think your answer to the first question of the title of this talk, where are we now, you mentioned we are at a paradox, the paradox of the unviability of a two-state solution, but yet the continued resilience of the two-state paradigm and the structures that have been created around that paradigm. And then your answer to the question, where do we go from here? Well, it's not really clear where people do want to go from here or where they can go from here. So let me maybe ask you to think a little bit more about how people discuss that paradox, how people talk about that paradox. You've mentioned, going back to the Israeli election, I was intrigued by your reference to Prime Minister Netanyahu's argument that the occupation is a reality, that Israel has won in the conflict with the Palestinians, and that the status quo is actually viable and sustainable with no real cost exacted from Israel. And I'm curious, now that we are in an election season in Israel, is there a counter message to that narrative? So if we have the counter message of separation, well, what is the rationale of separation when the occupation is actually working and sustainable? So how do people talk about that paradox in Israel? Secondly, if I could force you to give some advice to what I would call the well-intentioned diplomats who have invested lives, careers, and who still find the optimism to keep going on this issue. If you were to advise on the diplomacy, what would you tell the diplomats? Because the diplomacy for a long time has been structured around attempting to reach a final status agreement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, dealing with the core issues of Jerusalem, refugees, security, territory, in a way that would actually culminate in the creation of a Palestinian state and reverse the reality of the occupation. If we were to go back to a viable diplomatic track, would that paradigm of diplomacy still have relevance? Or would we have to envisage a completely different concept of diplomacy to address the starkly altered reality that you presented for us today?
Thanks a lot, Kareem. Let me address both of those parts. I think the answer to the first question about how all this is playing out in the Israeli election campaign is essentially this is not the terrain on which the opposition to Netanyahu want to fight the election. Basically, this former chief of staff who's leading this party, which is neck and neck on the party-to-party contest, actually slightly ahead of Netanyahu's Likud party. This blue and white party, they're slightly ahead. Coalition-wise, it's not so simple. But their leader, this former chief of staff, Benny Gantz, when he spoke in a side meeting at the recent Munich Security Conference, I don't know, Nabil, if you attended Gantz's talk at Munich, but did you hear Gantz at Munich? No. So what Gantz said is, on Iran, he said there's no difference, Iran and the region, no difference between myself and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he didn't refer to the Palestinians at all. So the election, the attempt to unseat Netanyahu is being fought on the terrain of corruption, too long in power. I mean, his message is, thank you, Bibi, and we've got it from here. And where it touches on these issues is to basically say, you've gone too far, you're too beholden to extremists who want to pull us into a binational reality. And that's where the separation comes in. So Gantz's message is, you are empowering people who will make it impossible to separate from these Palestinians. We don't want these Palestinians to be living among us, to be citizens. We don't want to have to face up to that dilemma. We have to separate from them. And then he sets out a series of terms which are terms for separation, not terms for peace or Palestinian statehood. My message to well-intentioned diplomats would be no point going back to negotiations. You have to create the conditions whereby a political process of some description would have a different outcome. And it's about creating the conditions. And I would maybe put three things on that list. Number one, I think it's important that as long as we're in the two-state paradigm, there is a repeated, concerted, loud, and spelled out in as many fora, and if we could find the best fora to spell it out in, then even better, reassertion of what are the parameters for two states. To make this point that when we say two states, this is what we mean. 67 lines, Jerusalem, refugees, etc., full sovereignty, security for both peoples, security that does not undermine Palestinian sovereignty, etc. But also to add something to that message. And I think the message at this level from the international community should be, here are the parameters. If you want two states, this is what it has to look like. By the way, if you're hell-bent on not getting to two states, then the only kind of alternative we can accept is an alternative in which everyone who lives under this new political reality that you would have created has equal rights. So if you don't want two states, you have to come up with a different dispensation in which everyone is equal. A clear anti-apartheidist message, which is the direction we're going in. Secondly, I think another thing that could be done is to really push for overcoming this internal Palestinian division, which is debilitating. And the role that other third parties can at least play is to say, if there is a Fatah-Hamas arrangement, then we will not be the obstacle. We will not place sanctions, boycott, a ban on the political structures that emerge from that. I think the three quartet conditions, if people remember from when there was a Palestinian election that Hamas won, those three quartet conditions were no violence, respect existing agreements, recognize Israel. Well, I'm sorry, but two of those are the outcome of a political process, not the precondition for a political process. No one has said to Israel, if you want us to engage with you, you have to recognize an independent Palestinian state on the 67 lines, and you have to respect previous agreements. The one condition should be, to abide by international law when it comes to not using violence against innocent civilians. So I think there should be a preemptive, forward-leaning international position to encourage the Palestinian leadership to overcome its division crisis. Because I think only an effective Palestinian strategy will only emerge once we get beyond the division. And the third thing is the following, and I'll keep it at headlines because it can get too detailed. Most international policy for a long time now has basically said, we will judge most of what we do on this issue by whether it's good or bad for the peace process. And I think that is not a valid way to go under the current conditions. And so I think it takes a change in approach, which is to say, we will judge our reactions to anything by whether it is respectful of people's inalienable rights and of international law or not. So you don't say, you know what, yeah, this demolition of something in Area C is very bad, but the Americans might be about to put out their plan. It's a delicate moment for the peace process. We're not going to mention it. Or something might be happening in Gaza, but one should have a position that takes as its starting point, people have rights, international law applies, where that is being violated, we will take a stand. I'm not sure how much it will translate into in terms of actual practical steps that will carry a cost or consequence for Israeli violations of international law, but I think it's the right starting point, and I'd like to think that over time that's the direction it will go in.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me open it up for questions from the audience. Let me take a round of questions, and I would ask whoever does have a question or a comment for our speaker, if you identify yourself first, please, and then pose your question or comment.
Unforeseeable possibility of pressure exerted on Israel. We tried everything. We tried UN, we tried Security Council, we tried Intifada, but there is none of these succeeded to make real pressure on Israel to give any respect to international laws, to give any respect to the one state or two state solutions whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, it seems we're back to the parallels you've left us with.
Yeah, let me make two comments on that, which are carrying on from that last point I made about seeing things right now primarily through the lens of rights and international law. I think in this period it might even be a distraction to focus too much on one or two states. I think most of the focus should be building up Palestinian capacity again. And by capacity, I don't mean the stuff that Salam Fayyad was doing. I mean political, strategic capacity. And trying to kind of challenge Israel with the violations to international law, a rights-based perspective. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Israel, in the Israeli Football League, there are 5 clubs that play in settlements illegally over the Green Line. They are part of the Israeli Football Association's remit. The issue was raised in FIFA, in football's international governing body, that Israel should not be allowed to be a member in good standing of FIFA if the Israeli clubs in settlements continue to be in the Israeli league. Now, most of you are probably looking at me with blank expressions because you've never heard of this issue before, or maybe you heard about it in passing. I think, look, FIFA is not the most transparent governing body in the world, and it wouldn't have been easy to have won a fight in FIFA. But I don't think an attempt was even made. So when you say we've tried everything, a Palestinian leadership effort that for 2 years said, we are going to address, but by the way, if you want to change the conversation in Israel, you place a choice in front of Israel. Either you take the settlement clubs out of your league, or you're not allowed to play in international footballing competition. If you want to talk about impact, about challenging impunity, I think here you will understand the importance of football, right? It's over the weight it carries, well in excess of. So imagine a situation in which the entire Palestinian effort, political, sympathizers effort around the world, pro-Palestinian campaigning, had been focused on this. Maybe it would have won, maybe it wouldn't, but there wasn't an attempt made. And so when you say tried everything, I disagree with you there. Now, I think the first Intifada, which is largely forgotten, it was an unarmed Intifada. That was a case of genuine mass popular mobilization. The first Intifada, I think, had an impact. Israel looked for a way out. It found Oslo, eventually. By the way, the second Intifada had an impact. Israel pulled out of Gaza. I'm not advocating violence. I ultimately think that you'll lose more. And I think the moral high ground is the right place to be, which you can't be on if you're using violence against innocent civilians. But I do think popular mobilization is very difficult and has not been attempted in that way since the first Intifada. But I also look at this phenomenon of the BDS campaign, the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. And what I see is something driven by civil society that I understand, that I think is absolutely legitimate, that I don't think is particularly strategic. But at its core is about creating a sanction for those who are denying Palestinian freedom. However, bereft of a political movement, of a political actor leading it, not civil society, I think it would be very difficult for that to become something strategic. I mean, imagine if you didn't have an ANC in South Africa. I think a sanctions campaign without an ANC wouldn't have led to what it led to, not that it was just the sanctions that led to that outcome. So when I talk about strategy and agency on the Palestinian side, those are the kinds of things I'm talking about.
Thank you, Daniel. Dean Fahmy?
Thank you, Daniel. As usual, it's very coherent and interesting. You're basically saying that the prospects for a solution of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process is not in the immediate cards if one looks at the different components. I agree with you completely that I actually think that there are a lot of things that can be done as a series of steps to increase the pressure on Israel society so that they feel that there are consequences even without violence. So I agree with you on that. My question, however, is with a big caveat. The main sponsor of the peace process, and in many cases, in many ways, I think it's the main host of events rather than the real host of the peace process, is the U.S. Most of the movements in the peace process started in the region and then were hosted by the U.S. to bring to closure or to hold the event. But clearly the U.S. today is itself respecting the basic components of the peace process. So, and I don't think that the Trump administration will change in that respect. Let's assume the deal of the century is presented and does not work. Or assume that in the next elections, if not before, the American president is changed by another candidate from Republicans or a Democrat. Will the U.S. position change? And if not, is there an alternative? What should we do? Go regional? Or is there go to the UN? What would you suggest as the force to bring it all together again? Even though I agree with you that for the time being, things need to be done on the ground with the people and in codifying the basic tenets of the peace process.
Back to diplomacy again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think that sometimes one is in a situation and you can clearly locate where there's a way forward, one can clearly locate where the holdout factor is and what are the set of circumstances that can be brought to bear to change that equation, and whether people can summon the political will or not, the marching instructions are quite clear. Now, that's partly true of the situation we're talking about. The holdout is essentially the more powerful party, the occupying power. But the causal line between where we are now and getting to somewhere is I think, very muddy. And therefore, where I go with that in my head is one has to be pushing on multiple fronts. One of which is the US, the only party that carries this and that has been basically given a free pass by everyone else to do so. However, if you had a change in the US within what I would call the realms of the possible, in other words, I can see an administration that would take a very different position to this one, would be ready to get in the face, as administrations have in the past of an Israeli leadership, perhaps to get in their face more assertively, but within limitations. I don't see the leverage that America could bring to play being brought to play. In other words, for the Israelis, the equation is, given how invested we are in this control, in preventing a withdrawal, genuine Palestinian independence, something really big has to be threatened. However, I think if you narrow that gap of just how cost-free this is, then you free up a debate inside Israel about doing other things. And to do that, several things have to happen. One of them is an America that is no longer empowering the most extreme elements in Israel, but is empowering more moderate elements inside Israel. Another one is a Palestinian side that can no longer be so easily dismissed. I mean, where we really are today is that Israelis essentially see the current Palestinian leadership as a pushover. And that's a bad place to be. You need to respect your adversary. And the Israelis have more respect for the guys in Gaza than they do for the guys in Ramallah. And that's a very bad place to be. And so what I'm saying is, that's another part of the equation that has to change. I think there is also a regional part of the equation that has to change. I don't think anyone else will grapple control from the Americans, but there doesn't have to be quite so much lack of initiative elsewhere. just look at where we are. It's March 2019. Since Trump came into office, no one else has really taken any initiative on this issue. And you go around most capitals and they'll say, we just have to wait to see what's in. Jason was in Prague last week. He told Jared was just in the. We just have to hear what the plan's coming out any week now. We've been there for 2 years almost, certainly for the last year, and the vacuum that is others not acting, I think, is a problem and could and should change.
Thank you. Yes, sir, I saw.
For quite a while. And with your permission, maybe I will draw 3 inferences from what you were saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And I will add a thought of my own, and then I'll put a question to you. Now, this sounds more complicated than what it's going to be. Now, it seems that the discussions about the issues relating to Israel and Palestine have been overwhelmed for a long time with the narrative of peace. And it seems obvious that neither side was interested in peace. They were interested in land. And peace was just something that was politically correct to be said along the way. If they were interested in peace, they would have achieved it, obviously, a long time ago. But obviously, it's no peace at any price. And land for peace is something that never really meant anything. It is land at any cost. And it seems that that's what it is. Now, it seems that we like to think of our world as being made up of states that have unchangeable borders. However, when we just look back, what happened in the decolonization period after the Second World War, or more recently in Central and Eastern Europe, with the tectonic changes after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and what happened in the neighborhood here, in the eastern part of Africa. Even now, we have the discussion between Serbia and Kosovo about changing borders. So who is to say that the borders that we are looking at on the map here are not changeable? And there's also another thing, that it seems that one doesn't like the idea that the price is always paid for lost wars. And it seems that what we are discussing here is a situation where a bloc of Arab states has lost several wars to Israel. And the issue is who is paying the price for it. And except for the Golan Heights and the farms in Lebanon, the price seems to have been paid by the Palestinians. And maybe we should not be surprised that the dark area on the map that you have displayed there has been reducing steadily over the last few decades. There is a price to be paid for lost wars. And humanity has not changed that over the many millennia now. But the last thing I wanted to mention is it seems that in this area, for a long time, Israel was perceived as the chief villain by all of the Arab neighbors. And what we seem to witness in the last couple of years, possibly in the last year and a half and 2 mostly, is that the chief villain is not Israel anymore, and that it is Iran. And that many of the Arab states in this broader area are quite willing to come to an accommodation with Israel with an understanding that a bloc needs to be formed to face the Iranian peril. Having said all of that, I'm really intrigued to hear your opinion as to would a 2-state solution be possible if one contemplated other lands than those just indicated on the map in front of us? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. Let me make a couple of comments on your comments and then get to your question, if I may. I think it's too reductionist to say it's only about land. It's about land, historical narrative. There are the, and you know, this will be familiar terrain for you. There are less tangible things. And in fact, on land, the Palestinian position has been open to land swaps. I think your states with unchangeable borders, who says, would be well taken in Israel. And I think as Israel looks around this unstable Middle East, they drew a lot of comfort from the idea that perhaps the Palestinian territories would appear as less of an anomaly. There would be all kinds of parts of the region of indeterminate status, Kurdish areas, you know, perhaps parts of Libya, elsewhere. To get to your, by the way, I'm not sure how deep the Iran thing goes. I'd also urge a word of caution on that. But to get to your question, could one involve other lands? There have been proposals on the table to do some land swaps, as I mentioned. Some speak about much more far-reaching land arrangements, including ones involving significant parts of the Egyptian Sinai. I'm not sure there's too much appetite here for that. So I think when one's really kind of going into the creative zone on alternative land swap arrangements, that might be a subject you want to raise when you see officials here, but it might be a subject you really don't want to raise also when you see folks here. I mean, look, ultimately, we're actually talking about a very small part of the world. I tend to think that the big Palestinian territorial give was the historic decision to accept 22% of the land. That was the prices paid for lost wars. I think you go lower than that, and over time, assuming the Palestinians stay on the land and there's not a second Nakba, I think over time the dilemma that I talked about of two states looking impossible but showing resilience, I think that dilemma gets resolved in favor of moving beyond the two-state paradigm. See, I think at a certain moment, what remains of the Palestinian state on offer is so unattractive that the Palestinians basically turn around and say, you're here, Israel, you're not going anywhere, give us the vote. Just give us the vote. It's simple. So that's...
Thank you. I'm not sure, Ambassador, if you want to pose a counterpoint to Daniel's counterpoint to your point. But thank you. Yes, General Nader.
General.
Nader Al-Asr, welcome with them in Cairo. It's a long time we didn't meet, and we haven't met, and we didn't see each other. As you mentioned, Ariel Sharon announced his disengagement plan after he was under pressure from the American, after the declaration of the roadmap, and after the Geneva movement started to exert pressure on, and the Geneva movement was a joint movement, Palestinian-Israeli movement, and they succeeded to put some amount of pressure, and because of this pressure, Sharon decided to go for third option, for another plan, what so-called disengagement plan. His real goal from this disengagement plan to disengage Gaza from the West Bank, not to disengage from the Palestinians, and he succeeded to achieve this goal by leaving Gaza without coordinating with the real and the legitimate authority in Gaza, the legitimate Palestinian authority. As you mentioned before, that we need some regional pressure in order to push the current Israeli, which I don't believe that they're going to push anywhere, to move anywhere. But in the past, there was some talks about regional peace movement in order to put pressure and to keep this issue alive. Are there any possibility to revive such thing like this again, like Copenhagen in the past, or anything like this? Or we were talking about some other formulas of this peace movement. The second question I would like to ask you, the current statistics coming from Israel and from some other sources showing that the population between the Jordan River and the sea is 1-to-1. One Jewish to one Arabs. Does this mean that the Israelis does not understand the demographic threat, which will soon be, the Palestinian will be much more, or the Arabs will be much more, the population will be much more than the Jewish between the, and there are some other statistics regarding the Arab Israelis and the Palestinians abroad. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Nader, it's nice to see you. On that first point, some kind of regional peace movement, my thought on that is that, first of all, I think it's much more difficult today given the divisions within the region that we're all aware of. And Israel, but not only Israel, is very effective at playing within those divisions, at making itself a player. The Croatian ambassador talked about the whole Iran is the real enemy narrative, etc. So I think it's much more difficult. However, I tend to think that it will be very difficult to reposition and relaunch a new Palestinian push under the current leadership. However, I do see a scenario where a future Palestinian leader could generate a dynamic that gets enough of the region behind them. I think, the message needs to be repackaged, the priorities need to be rethought, and sometimes just the deliverer of the message needs to change. Putting a different face on the message matters. And for very good and justifiable reasons, the current leadership essentially feels abandoned and let down, and I don't think they will, and the president himself especially will get out of that. So I think I think what you suggested becomes relevant under a new leadership. On the demographics and how Israelis relate to that, I think there are a few answers to this, one of which is that for some Israelis it's a real problem. So as I mentioned, the one place where this issue features in the election campaign and is an attack point by the opposition to Netanyahu against Netanyahu is, you are leading us into a demographic stalemate where it will be impossible to redraw boundaries. It will be impossible to separate, and that can't be allowed to happen. So now Gantz has a bit of a problem making that too strong a part of his message, because one of the people he's allied himself with doesn't believe in any withdrawal whatsoever, which is the former Likud defense minister, Moshe Bughi Ya'alon. But that is part of the Gantz message. The counter message to that, the two reasons, I think, why the Israeli public are more relaxed than people may imagine they should be about this question is, number one, they've discounted Gaza. In your, and rightly so, in your number count, the 2 million Palestinian Gazans are included. As far as Israelis are concerned, Gaza is on a different planet. It's there on the border, it's an annoyance, but what are these marches of return about? What is the response to these marches of return about? And the killings of Palestinians who come close to the border. It's a statement that Gaza is out of the equation. Secondly, here's the problem. Israelis keep getting told, so many Palestinians, it can't go on like this, it's not sustainable. The experienced, lived reality for Israelis is, we've got this managed. We can control the Palestinians in their own tiny little islands of limited self-governance. We can control their movement. We've been told for decades that it's unsustainable. Well, at what point does our reality of sustainability become a stronger talking point than your theory of unsustainability? And that's the point we've reached and crossed already, actually. Israelis would need a palpable demonstration of unsustainability for that argument to hit home now. Because what they have lived and seen is the opposite, is that it's okay, we can control this number of Palestinians, and we've done it. We've managed to. And we'll adapt if we need to.
Thank you. We have time for one last question from Ambassador Shama.
Thank you. Ambassador Karim, thank you very much. Daniel, very interesting points, but disappointed with you that you did not provide the solution. But anyway, you provided some very interesting pointers. Let me just take you in relation to what you just mentioned now on the sustainability issue, and take you to something you've mentioned at the very beginning, and that is about the sort of spatial cognitive map that is carried around from the one side by the settlers and from the other side by the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Take that forward into Israel proper, your last map, your suggestion, your reality proposed, whatever you want to label it. And take into consideration what was mentioned a couple of days ago by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that is an interesting observation, that Israel's Arab population, and here we're not talking about the territories, we're talking about Israel's Arab population, could not fully be considered citizens of the country. Now, let's look at it from the legal point of view. Legally speaking, is that sustainable? Is that sort of model been seen anywhere else around the globe, apart from the short phase of apartheid in South Africa? But currently, do you think about any other place where you have such a system, where you have two sets of laws differentiating citizens of the same country? Not speaking about even outside of Israel proper, but in the occupied territories or the settlements. Now, That's one question on whether something like this is feasible, sustainable. How long can it be or go unchallenged, or can it go unchallenged? At the same time, the other point refers to your closing statement that the increasing impossibility of a two-state solution, but also the surprising resilience of the two-state paradigm. How do you see that resilience? I'm not able to really put my hands on that resilience part. I'm actually seeing more what you're describing here in your last part. Thank you.
Thank you. And if the ambassador will permit me just to build on what I think is a very key question for you to address for us, Daniel. At what point do we start thinking that the nature of the conflict has changed from a national conflict, an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to an ethnic Arab-Jewish conflict in the entirety of the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan? As you said, and as the ambassador mentioned, the conflict is now spilling over into Israel proper. And of course, I mean, that's always been part of the conflict, but now we see it in very stark terms, as the ambassador reminded us. So are we actually seeing a transformation in the nature of the conflict itself?
It's a good place to end, and I appreciate you raising that point. It's implicit in Netanyahu's life mission and in everything he's done. And I've got Israeli friends checking. If indeed it is the case that that is the first time he has said that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, this is really quite dramatic, as you say. I mean, that's still percolating in my head, the implications, because I think this is a dramatic turning point. By the way, let's, again, not extrapolate too far, let's not get too carried away, but the signal that sends, when one thinks of a history of a Nakba already having been committed, the signal that sends is extremely powerful and dangerous. But for those who didn't follow it, there was a spat on Instagram, and one of the things that Netanyahu said in response to a popular TV personality basically making the case that Arabs are people too and Arabs are citizens too, was Israel is not a state of all its citizens. To me, what that then comes down to is sustainability holds until the moment that Palestinian agency challenges that sustainability in a way where it can no longer hold. And I do think that is more than conceivable. I'm not sure it's inevitable, but I certainly see that coming. Now, because what has the peace effort been about? The peace effort at one level has been about drawing a rather random line in this conflict, and that random line is 67. And basically saying we can resolve the 67 issues. And to take 67 as the starting point is an incredibly convenient stepping off point for Israel. But the history of the peace process, amongst other things, is a history of Israel's unwillingness to take yes for an answer. Because actually what you got with the PNC Algiers Declaration of 1988 was the Palestinian yes. It was the Palestinian acceptance of Nakba. That's a huge thing. It was the Palestinian acceptance of 22%. And what you got in 2002, what you got in 2002 with the Arab League endorsement of the Arab Peace Initiative was a pan-Arab yes. Israel got to yes with the Palestinians, Israel got to yes with the Arab world, and Israel went on with its own project. And I'm not sure you can turn back from that. It's not a coincidence that this is the map that I put up there. So the inability to take a convenient 67 starting point and the yes that Israel got to on that means that the 48 file is reopened. What are the marches of return? It's the reopening of the 48 file. And that's my point about the resilience. It's not a resilience on the ground. It's the fact that despite everything, the position of Fatah, the position of the PLO remains a two-state position. In the renewed political document that Hamas put out when Khaled Mashal stood down as leader a couple of years ago, the movement was moving closer to two states rather than closer to a kind of one state. That's why I'm saying there's a resilience there. It can only be a Palestinian decision to say we tried. For us, 67 was always, we understand you're not going anywhere, but actually for us, this was all part of our historic homeland. We will now fight to share this homeland as equals with you. That's a better way to address the refugee problem. We don't want a border here and to take 22%. You know, I'm putting words into the mouths of a future Palestinian leadership that may or may not be spoken. But in the absence of that becoming the Palestinian platform, the surprising resilience of two states is still a headline.
Daniel, you have left us all certainly better informed, certainly with a deeper understanding of the dynamics of the conflict and the reality that exists today. Perhaps that no less frustrated than when we came in, but certainly you...
May I say one more thing?
Please.
If that did happen, there are two directions the Israeli response can go in. Maybe three directions. One is to say, where are those old plans for a two-state solution? Can we dust them off? Because suddenly this is sounding really rather attractive. There's another one, which is to say, right, we better put a stop to this. Let's do unilateral separation on our terms. And there's a third response is, of course, there's the third response is we totally reject it. We'll just try and sustain the status quo, and that will be the response probably. But there's another response, which is over time. You know what? This is all our land as well. And eventually we're going to have to come to terms with you. Sorry, that was...
No, I think that's a much more interesting note to end on than a lot of what we discussed. Daniel, thank you. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for framing what is a complex and difficult situation in terms that I think compel us to think differently about the situation. And thank you for joining us today. I hope it's been a source of real value added in terms of our understanding of the dynamics in the Israeli-Palestinian realm. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in extending a word of thanks to Daniel for his insights tonight. Thank you.